The morning Fannie Callahan buried her father, she also buried the last man in Concho County, who believed a woman had any business driving 3,000 head of longhorn cattle 400 miles to Kansas. It was the spring of 1877, and the dust of the burial mound had not yet settled when the men who worked the Callahan ranch stood in a loose half-circle at the edge of the graveyard, hats in their hands, waiting to see what she would do next. Fannie was 22 years old, dressed in her mother's mourning black with her father's revolver strapped over it because she had forgotten to take it off before the service, and she looked at every one of those men in turn before she spoke. "Drive north in 9 days," she said. "Same as Pa planned. Anybody who don't want to follow a woman can collect his wages today and ride on." 4 men rode off that same afternoon. Tobias Wren, who had been foreman under her father for 11 years, was not among them, but he came to her that evening on the porch of the ranch house with his hat crushed in his hands and told her plainly that he could not, in good conscience, take orders from a girl who had never spent a night on the open trail. "I ain't asking your conscience, Tobias," Fannie told him. "I'm asking, will you ride or won't you?" "I won't," he said, and he meant it kindly, the way a man means a thing he has decided is for someone's own good. "Not because you ain't smart, Miss Callahan, because the trail don't care how smart you are. It only cares if you're strong enough and mean enough and lucky enough, all three at once for 400 miles. Your pa had 30 years of that behind him. You got none." He left the next morning with 2 of the younger hands, and that left Fannie with 6 drovers. A cook named Sourdough Pete, who was nearly 70 and had nowhere else to go, and a debt to the Concho County Bank that would swallow the ranch whole if 3,000 head of Callahan cattle did not reach the railhead at Dodge City before the first snow. Her father, Michael Callahan, had built that ranch out of nothing after the war, out of Irish stubbornness and Texas dirt, and in the last year of his life, a wasting sickness in his lungs had taken the strength from him long before it took his breath. He had mortgaged 2 seasons ahead against the promise of this drive, certain he would live to make it himself. He had not, and so it fell to Fannie, his only child, to either lead 3,000 head of cattle to market or watch the bank take everything he had ever loved besides her. She rode into the town of Menard 3 days after the funeral to hire on more hands, and that was where she first laid eyes on Oscar Keller. He was standing outside the livery with a saddle over one shoulder, a lean, sun-browned man of perhaps 28, with a scar through one eyebrow that gave him a look of permanent mild surprise, and he was in the middle of turning down a job from a rancher named Kerhouse when Fannie walked up and heard the tail end of it. "I don't drive for men who cheat their hands out of bonus pay," Oscar was saying. "Ask around. I got a reputation for keeping my word, and I expect the same." Curl spat and walked off cursing him, and Oscar Keller turned and found himself looking at a young woman in a black dress with a revolver on her hip, studying him like he was a horse she was thinking of buying. "You know cattle?" she asked him. "I've put 9 drives up the trail, 2 as trail boss." He looked her over not unkindly but with the frank appraisal of a man who had learned to size up trouble before it found him. "You're Callahan's girl, Fannie Callahan. My father passed 2 weeks back. I'm taking our herd north myself, and I need a trail boss who knows the western trail all the way to Dodge City, because the fool who was supposed to do it quit on me for having the wrong parts." Oscar almost laughed, and then did not, because there was nothing funny in her face, only a kind of raw determination that made him look at her twice. "Ma'am, no disrespect to your grief, but leading a herd that size takes more than nerve. It takes 14, 15 hands who trust the man giving the orders enough to ride into a stampede if he tells them to. Cowhands don't take kind to being told what to do by a woman," she finished for him. "I've heard it every day this week. I'll hear it 100 more times before Kansas, I expect. That don't change the math. My herd goes north or my father's ranch dies with him. I need a trail boss. I'm asking you because everyone I've talked to in 3 towns says Oscar Keller is the best drover between the Rio Grande and the Arkansas River, and because you just turned down good money on a point of honor, which tells me you might actually keep a promise to a woman nobody else will." He studied her a long moment. There was dust on her boots and grief still fresh in the lines around her eyes, but her chin was up and her voice did not shake. "What's the pay?" he said at last, and it was not quite a yes, but it was not a no either. "Same as any trail boss gets, plus a bonus of $2 a head over what my father promised, paid the day we sell in Dodge City. And my word, Mr. Keller, which I intend to keep same as you keep yours." He thought of his own mother, widowed young in Missouri, and of the men who had looked past her the way people look past a fence post, and something in him turned over. "All right, Miss Callahan," he said. "I'll ride as your trail boss, but I want it understood plain between us now before we start. Out there, my word on the trail is law, same as it would be for any owner who hired me. You can overrule me on money and on selling and on anything that happens once we hit Dodge City. But between here and there, when cattle are moving and trouble's coming, you let me call it, or we're both liable to get good men killed." Fannie held out her hand, the way she had seen her father seal 100 deals, and Oscar Keller, a little surprised, shook it. "Agreed," she said. "Long as you remember whose herd it is and whose name goes on the note at the bank." "I won't forget it," he said, and something about the steadiness in her eyes made him believe, for the first time since Kurros had cursed him in the street, that this drive might actually get done. They rode out from the Callahan ranch 9 days after the funeral, just as Fannie had promised, with 3,040 head of longhorn cattle stringing out red and brindle, and done across 2 miles of the Concho River Valley, dust rising behind them like a second sky. Sourdough Pete drove the chuck wagon. Oscar Keller rode point. And Fannie Callahan rode near the front of the herd on her father's old gray gelding, wearing her father's coat, because it was the only thing large enough to keep out the cold mornings, and she did not look back at the house. The hands Oscar had scraped together on short notice were a mixed lot. 2 brothers named Silas and Amos Fitch, who had drifted up from Corpus Christi looking for work. A quiet Cherokee man named Henry Two Rivers, who could rope anything on 4 legs. A boy of 19 named Tommy Larkin making his first drive. And an older man called Def Ruiz on account of a cannon that had gone off too close to his head at some battle nobody quite remembered the name of. None of them had asked to work for a woman. All of them had needed the wages badly enough to try it anyway. For the first several days, they watched Fannie the way men watch weather that might turn ugly. She rode drag sometimes, eating dust with the greenest hand, because she would not ask anyone to do a job she was not willing to do herself. She learned the names of every man's horse before she learned some of the men's middle names. When Tommy Larkin got pitched from his saddle trying to turn a runaway steer and came up limping and red-faced with embarrassment, it was Fannie who rode over and told him, loud enough for the others to hear, that she had been thrown worse than that by gentler horses, and it had never once made her stupid, only smarter the second time. Oscar watched all of this from the corner of his eye, saying nothing, but noticing. The first real test came on the 9th day, at the crossing of the Concho, where it widened out into a stretch of quick brown water swollen from spring rains. The herd balked at the bank, the lead steers turning back into the ones behind them, and for a moment 3,000 head of cattle threatened to knot themselves into a chaos that could crush a rider under their hooves without any of them meaning to. "They won't take the water," Silas Fitch called out. "River's running too high, Miss Callahan. We ought to wait a day, let it drop." "We can't spare a day," Fannie said. "Every day we lose is a day closer to snow in Kansas before we sell." She looked to Oscar. "What would you do if this was your herd?" "I'd put a strong swimmer out front to break the water first, get one bold steer to commit, and the rest generally follow." He hesitated. "It's dangerous work. Whoever does it is liable to get pulled under if his horse goes down." "Then I'll do it," Fannie said. And before Oscar could argue, she had already put her gray gelding down the bank and into the current, angling toward a big red steer with a crooked horn that the men called Lucifer for his temperament. Oscar's heart came up into his throat. He shouted after her, something about waiting for a rope man to back her up, but she was already committed, leaning forward, driving Lucifer's flank with the flat of her hand, forcing the animal deeper into the water until it had no choice but to swim or drown, and it swam. And behind it, the whole boiling mass of longhorns began at last to follow, plunging into the river in a great bawling column. Fanny's gelding stumbled on a hidden rock partway across and went down hard, pitching her sideways into the current. For one terrible instant Oscar saw her black hat vanish beneath the brown water and his whole chest went cold. He put his own horse into the river without a thought for the cattle streaming around him, fighting the current with his knees, and caught her arm just as she came up gasping, her father's coat dragging heavy with water. He hauled her half across his own saddle, cattle churning past them on both sides, and got her to the far bank where she lay coughing on the mud, alive, furious, and grinning up at him with water streaming off her chin. "We did it," she managed between coughs. "The herd's crossing." "You could have drowned," Oscar said, his voice rougher than he intended, fear still loud in his blood. "That was a fool thing to do, riding out there yourself instead of sending a man who'd done it before." "There wasn't time to argue about who ought to do it," Fanny said, sitting up, wringing water from her sleeve. "And Mr. Keller, in case you've forgotten, I am the man who'd have to answer to the bank if this herd don't get across a river 100 miles from anywhere. I'd rather risk drowning myself than ask one of your hands to risk it in my place." He looked at her for a long moment, water dripping off both of them, cattle still splashing across the ford behind, and something shifted quietly in his chest, some old certainty cracking open just slightly to let a new idea in. "No," he said finally, helping her to her feet. "I haven't forgotten." That night around the fire, Sourdough Pete told the story of the crossing with considerable embellishment, and by the time he finished, Deaf Ruiz was laughing so hard he had to wipe his eyes, and even the Fitch brothers were looking at Fanny with something less guarded than before. She had earned, in one plunge into cold water, what 100 speeches could not have bought her, the beginning of their respect. Oscar found her later, sitting a little apart from the fire, wrapped in a dry blanket, staring north toward Kansas, though there was nothing to see but stars. "You're going to get yourself killed before Dodge City," he said, settling onto a rock near her, not too close. "Maybe," she said, "but I intend to get this herd there first, killed or not." She glanced sideways at him. "You didn't have to come after me in that river." "Yes, I did," he said, and did not explain further, and she did not ask him to. They talked that night longer than either of them meant to. She told him about her mother, dead of fever when Fanny was 12, and about her father teaching her to rope calves before she could properly reach the stirrups, laughing at her when she missed, laughing harder and prouder when she finally caught one clean. She told him she had never once, in all her father's plans for this drive, imagined she would be the one to lead it, until the sickness had made the choice for her. He told her in turn about growing up on a hardscrabble farm outside Springfield, Missouri, about a father who had died at Wilson's Creek when Oscar was 12, and a mother who had raised 4 children alone on rented land, about how he had gone west at 17 because there was nothing left in Missouri but debt and grief, and had found on the cattle trails the first place in his life where a man was judged only by what he could actually do, and not by what he owned or who his people were. "Funny," Fanny said when he'd finished. "You went looking for a place that judges a person fair, and here I am asking you to work for a boss half your hands don't think deserves fair judging at all." "They'll come around," Oscar said. "Some already have, give it time." "And you," she asked, watching him in the firelight, "have you come around?" He was quiet a moment, and when he answered his voice had gone low and careful, the way a man speaks when he is admitting something to himself as much as to the person listening. "I came around the day I watched you pull a bull steer into that river with your own hands rather than ask a man to take a risk you weren't willing to take yourself. Miss Callahan, I have ridden with trail bosses twice your age and half again your grit who wouldn't have done what you did today." She smiled at that, small and tired and real, and for a moment the space between them felt very warm despite the cold night, and neither of them moved to close it, though both of them, if pressed, might have admitted they wanted to. The drive rolled north through the weeks that followed, across the rolling scrub country toward the Red River, and each day added its own small measure to the store of trust building between Fannie and her crew. She learned to read the sky the way Oscar did, learned which clouds meant an afternoon shower, and which meant a night they had better bed the herd down early and double the watch. She took her turn at night herd same as any hand, singing low to keep the cattle calm the way Sourdough Pete had taught her, an old ballad about a girl who waited for her sailor to come home from the sea, though there was no sea within 1,000 miles of the Western Trail. Oscar found himself listening for her voice on the nights she rode the far side of the herd from him, and telling himself it was only because a trail boss ought to know where every hand was at all hours, and knowing, even as he told himself that, it was not entirely the truth. There was a night, crossing into the Indian Territory, when rustlers tried the herd. It happened past midnight, under a moon thin as a paring knife, when 4 riders came in low and fast from the west trying to cut off 100 head or more, and pushed them into the dark before the camp woke fully to what was happening. Fannie was on watch with Henry 2 Rivers when the first shots cracked out and her heart went to ice, but her hands did not shake. "Fire over their heads," Oscar's voice came roaring out of the dark, already moving, already shouting the camp awake. "Don't shoot to kill unless they shoot first. We don't need blood, we need our cattle." Fannie put her gelding into a dead run parallel to the cut steers, matching pace with a rustler she could barely see in the gloom, and fired her father's revolver once into the air over his head. The man flinched, cursed, and peeled off rather than risk closer range, and 2 of his fellows did the same when Silas Fitch and Tommy Larkin came pounding up with rifles blazing skyward. It was Oscar who caught the 4th rustler, tackling him bodily from horseback in a move Fannie would later swear was more courage than sense, and held him at gunpoint until the others had scattered into the night, leaving their comrade behind. In the gray light before dawn they discovered, he was hardly more than a boy, 16 at most, thin and frightened, who confessed through chattering teeth that he and his brothers had been driven off their own small spread by drought 2 years past, and had turned to cutting cattle from passing herds because there was nothing else left to feed his mother and sisters. Fannie looked at him a long while, remembering her own father's stories of hard years after the war, and something in her softened even as her jaw stayed firm. "We're not turning you over to any marshal," she said finally. "But you tell your brothers if I catch any of you near my herd again, I will not be so kind twice. And you." She nodded toward the boy's thin wrists, the hollows under his eyes. "There's a ranch 2 days south of here, the Hendersons. They're short-handed and decent people. Tell them Fannie Callahan sent you, and that you're willing to work honest for honest pay." The boy stared at her like she'd offered him the moon, mumbled a thanks that cracked in the middle, and rode off into the brightening morning, and the crew watched her with new eyes after that too, understanding now that her mercy was not weakness but a kind of strength they had not expected from a woman who could put a bullet exactly where she aimed it and still choose not to. "You could have let the marshal at Fort Sill deal with him," Oscar said later, riding beside her as the herd began moving again. "I could have," Fannie agreed. "But my father used to say that mercy costs a man nothing he can't spare, and cruelty costs him something he can never get back. I'd rather be a woman folks say was too soft on a hungry boy than one who sent a child to hang for cattle he didn't even manage to steal." Oscar said nothing for a while, but that evening, when he thought she wasn't looking, he watched her across the campfire with an expression that had stopped trying to hide itself as mere professional respect. It was somewhere past the Cimarron River, in the last week of July, with the sun hammering the plains flat and white and the grass gone brown and brittle underfoot, that the drive nearly ended in disaster, and that Fannie Callahan and Oscar Keller finally admitted, out loud, what had been growing quietly between them for 2 months. A dry lightning storm came up out of nowhere on a hot, still evening, the sky going the color of an old bruise, and before anyone could get the herd bedded down proper, a bolt struck close enough to set half the cattle screaming and running. 3,000 head of longhorn cattle in a full stampede is a sound like the end of the world, a thundering wall of horn and muscle that can crush a rider and horse both without ever slowing down. And Fannie found herself caught up in the middle of it when her gelding spooked and bolted straight into the heart of the running herd. She heard Oscar shouting her name somewhere behind her, but the world had narrowed down to the animal beneath her, and the horns on either side and the desperate, blind need to stay in the saddle and turn the gelding's head toward open ground before they were both trampled under. Lightning cracked white overhead, throwing the running cattle into strange, stuttering relief, and for one long, terrible stretch of seconds Fannie thought with perfect calm that she was going to die out here on the Kansas plains, 400 miles from home, with the ranch still unsaved and her father's grave still fresh. Then Oscar was there somehow, driving his horse in alongside hers at a dead run, close enough that his knee brushed hers, and he reached across and got a fist around her reins near the bit, and hauled both horses hard to the left, out of the main press of the herd, out toward a shallow draw where the running cattle would not follow. They broke free of the stampede together, horses blowing and trembling, and did not stop until they were well clear, on a low rise above the draw, watching the herd thunder past below them in the strobing lightning like a river of dark water. Fannie was shaking, whether from fear or the aftermath of terror she could not have said, and Oscar swung down from his horse and pulled her down from hers almost in the same motion, and then they were simply holding onto each other in the rain that had begun to fall, her face pressed against his wet shirt, his arms locked around her like he meant never to let a stampede or anything else take her from him again. "I thought I'd lost you," he said into her hair, his voice cracked open in a way she had never heard from him. "Fannie, I thought—" "I'm here," she said, gripping the front of his shirt. "I'm here, Oscar." It was the first time either of them had used the other's given name. He pulled back just enough to look at her face in the intermittent lightning, rain running down both of them, and whatever careful distance he had been keeping for 2 months collapsed all at once. "I have tried," he said. "God knows I have tried to keep my mind only on the herd and the trail and my duty to you as your hired boss. But I can't do it anymore, Fannie. I have watched you ride into rivers and stand up to rustlers and forgive a boy who tried to steal from you. And I have fallen in love with you somewhere along about 400 miles of Texas and Indian Territory. And I don't care anymore if that is a foolish thing for a trail boss to say to the woman paying his wages." Fannie let out something between a laugh and a sob, the tension of the stampede and the fear, and the weeks of careful distance all breaking loose at once. "It is a foolish thing to say," she told him. "On account of I have been sitting up half the nights on this drive telling myself the very same thing about you, and wondering how in creation I was ever going to say it first." He kissed her then, there on the low rise above the draw with the storm rolling off east and the herd finally slowing below them. And it was not a careful kiss, not the kiss of two people minding their manners, but the kiss of two people who had each nearly died that night and found, in the middle of the danger, the one thing worth surviving for. They rode back to gather the scattered herd afterward, because there was cattle business that would not wait even for love, but something had settled between them that would not unsettle again, a certainty as solid as the Kansas ground beneath their tired horses. The days that followed had a different quality to them, though the work did not lessen and the danger did not disappear. Oscar found himself riding closer to Fannie through the long afternoons than trail business strictly required, and neither of them minded the crew noticing, because by now most of the crew had guessed anyway, and Sourdough Pete had taken to humming wedding tunes at the chuck wagon fire loud enough for everyone to hear, grinning his gap-toothed grin whenever Fannie glared at him. They lost only 60 head to the stampede, fewer than Oscar had feared, and spent 3 days gathering the scattered stock before pushing north again, And it was during those gathering days that Fanny proved herself once more, riding into a stand of scrub oak alone to rope a bull that had wedged itself into a ravine, working the frightened animal free with a patience and skill that made even the Fitch brothers whistle in admiration. Where'd a rancher's daughter learn to handle a bull like that? Amos Fitch asked her that evening, not with the old suspicion but with genuine curiosity. My father, Fanny said simply. He never once told me there was something I couldn't learn because I was born a girl instead of a boy. Told me the cattle didn't care what I was born, only what I could do. Wish more men thought that way, Amos said, and went back to his coffee. And that was, in its way, as much of an apology as any of the doubting men on that drive would ever offer, and Fanny found she did not need more than that. They crossed into Kansas in the middle of August, the grass turning golden under a relentless sun, the herd thinner and tougher and trail-hardened after so many miles, moving now with the steady rhythm of animals who had learned, same as their drovers, what the trail demanded of them. Word had begun to travel ahead of them, the way word does on the frontier, carried by other outfits met along the trail, by cowhands in the little supply towns where they stopped to resupply flour and coffee and horseshoe nails. The Callahan herd, folks were saying, drove by a woman clean from Concho County, crossed the Cimarron in a lightning storm and never lost more than 60 head, fought off rustlers without hardly firing a shot in anger. Some of the talk was admiring, some skeptical, some outright disbelieving that a woman could have done any such thing without a man secretly running the whole affair. But the talk kept spreading regardless, growing a little in the telling the way such talk always does, until by the time they were within 100 miles of Dodge City, there were cattlemen in 3 counties who had heard the name Fannie Callahan and wanted to see for themselves if the stories could possibly be true. It was in the little cow town of Pratt, taking on supplies, that Fanny first encountered the doubt turned openly hostile rather than merely skeptical. A cattle buyer named Grantham Voss, a stout man with a gold watch chain and an opinion of himself considerably larger than his actual importance, cornered her outside the general store and informed her, without being asked, that he had heard of her drive and considered the whole business an embarrassment to decent Texas ranching. A woman playing at trail boss, he said, not quite hiding his contempt beneath a veneer of concern. It's not fitting, Miss Callahan, and I'll tell you plain, when you get to Dodge City, you'll find the buyers there share my opinion. Nobody wants to close a deal with cattle that were driven by a girl playing dress-up as a man. You do better to sell your herd to me now, at a fair price, and spare yourself the humiliation of being turned away at the stockyards. Fanny felt the old anger rise in her, the same anger she'd swallowed 100 times since her father's funeral, but she had learned something on the trail these past months about the uses of a level voice. Mr. Voss, she said, my cattle have crossed 4 rivers and survived a stampede and outrun rustlers without losing more than 2% of the herd, which I'd wager is a better record than half the outfits you've bought from this season. When we reach Dodge City, I intend to sell to whichever buyer offers the fairest price for the finest condition cattle on the trail this year, and if that buyer happens to think less of me for being a woman, then he'll simply be paying top dollar to a woman he doesn't respect, which strikes me as a poor kind of victory for him to claim. Voss's face reddened, and he sputtered something about her being an unnatural sort of female and stalked off, and Oscar, who had come up beside her in time to hear the last of it, was grinning outright. You handled that better than I would have, he said. I was about 2 words from putting my fist through that man's gold watch chain. Wouldn't have helped, Fanny said, though she was pleased at his loyalty. Men like Voss don't change their minds from a punch. Only thing that changes their minds is watching a woman do the very thing they swore she couldn't. Then let's go show him, Oscar said, and they rode back to the herd together, and if his hand found hers for just a moment before they mounted up, neither of them made any particular note of it, though Tommy Larkin, watching from the corral fence, grinned to himself and said nothing to anyone. The last stretch into Dodge City tested them one final time, in a way that had nothing to do with weather or rustlers or stampedes, and everything to do with the ordinary human cruelty of men who could not bear to be shown up. Grantham Voss, still smarting from Fannie's refusal, had apparently ridden ahead and spread word among certain buyers in Dodge City that the Callahan herd was diseased, infected with the Texas fever that had closed markets to southern cattle in years past, a lie calculated to see her turned away from every stockyard in town without a single animal sold. It was a serious charge, the kind that could ruin a herd's reputation and a rancher's fortune in a single stroke, and when Fannie and Oscar rode into Dodge City 3 days ahead of the herd to arrange for the sale, they found the news had already done its damage. "I've heard the talk, Miss Callahan," said the first buyer they approached, a nervous man named Ellery Poe who ran one of the smaller commission houses near the stockyards. "Can't risk my reputation buying diseased stock, not with the fever scares we've had. I'm sorry, but I won't be making an offer." 2 more buyers gave nearly identical answers, and Fannie felt something cold and desperate settling into her stomach, the specter of the bank note, and everything her father had built rising up before her like a wall she could not climb. "We need a veterinary inspection," Oscar said that night, pacing their small hotel room's shared sitting area while Sourdough Pete dozed in a chair by the stove. "If we can prove the herd's clean," Voss lied outright, "that'll turn the tide back our direction. Dodge City's got an inspector, works for the Stockyards Association, checks herds for exactly this kind of dispute. And if he finds anything at all," Fannie said, "any hint of fever, real or not, we're finished. Voss will make sure of it." "Our herd is clean," Oscar said firmly. "I've driven cattle 11 years, Fannie. I know fever stock when I see it, and there's nothing wrong with a single animal in that herd. We drove them slow enough, watered them careful, kept them off the tick-infested bottomland the whole way up. Voss is lying because he's a small, mean man who can't stomach being bested by a woman, and the truth will bear that out if we make him prove his claim in front of witnesses." They rode out to meet the herd the next morning, still 2 days south of town, and found the stockyards inspector, a weathered, unsmiling man named Garrett Ames, willing to ride out with them and examine the cattle himself, provided Voss and any other interested buyers came along to witness the results firsthand. It took the better part of a day, walking the herd, examining hide and hoof and eye on animal after animal under the unforgiving Kansas sun, with Grantham Voss standing off to one side looking increasingly uneasy as head after head passed inspection clean. "There's not a trace of fever anywhere in this herd," Ames announced finally, wiping his hands on a rag, addressing the small crowd of buyers and drovers who had gathered to watch. "Finest condition Texas cattle I've inspected all season, if you want my professional opinion. Whoever started that rumor either never laid eyes on this herd or is lying through his teeth." Every eye turned to Voss, whose face had gone the color of old brick. "I heard it secondhand," he stammered. "I never claimed to have inspected them myself. I only passed along what I—" "You passed along a lie to ruin a rival's sale," Oscar said, stepping forward, his voice hard and cold in a way Fannie had rarely heard from him. "And you did it because a woman bested you in an argument outside a general store in Pratt, and your pride couldn't stand it. There's men in this territory who'd call that slander, Mr. Voss, and there's a court in Dodge City that would hear the case if Miss Callahan chose to bring it." Voss looked at Fannie, and whatever he saw in her face convinced him better than any threat could have. He mumbled something that might have been an apology, though it was too quiet and too bitten off to be certain, and left the stockyards at something close to a run, and did not trouble the Callahan herd again. Word of the confrontation traveled through Dodge City faster than the herd itself could walk there, and by the time the full 3,000 head arrived at the stockyards 2 days later, driven in a long, triumphant column down the wide dirt streets with Fannie riding point beside Oscar, and the whole crew fanned out behind them, There was a crowd gathered to watch, drawn by the story that had run ahead of them like wildfire through dry grass. The woman who drove her own herd from Texas. The girl who crossed the Cimarron in a lightning storm. The rancher's daughter who faced down a lying cattle buyer and made him run. Fannie Callahan rode into Dodge City on a bright September afternoon with her father's coat still on her shoulders and 3,000 and some odd head of Texas longhorn cattle behind her, having lost fewer animals to the whole 400-mile journey than most all-male outfits lost in a good year, and the crowd that watched her pass did not jeer or doubt. They cheered. The sale itself, when it came, was almost anticlimactic after everything that had led to it. With Voss's slander exposed and the herd's condition proven beyond dispute, 3 separate commission buyers competed openly for the Callahan cattle, driving the price up well past what Fannie's father had ever dared hope for. And by the end of the bidding, she had sold the entire herd for a sum that would not only clear the bank note in full, but leave enough besides to rebuild the barn her father had always meant to replace and buy new breeding stock for the following spring. She stood in the commission house office with the bank draft in her hand, feeling the weight of the past 6 months settle into something she could only describe as relief so profound it was almost painful, and when she looked up, Oscar was watching her from the doorway with an expression that made her forget for a moment that there was anyone else in the room at all. "We did it," she said. "You did it," Oscar corrected gently. "I called some plays out on the trail because that was the job you hired me for, but this herd is standing in the Dodge City stockyards today because Fannie Callahan decided it would be, and would not let anything, whether or rustlers or lying cattle buyers or her own crew's doubt, stand in her way." She crossed the small office and kissed him, right there in front of the startled commission clerk, and did not particularly care who saw. That evening, the whole crew gathered at a modest hotel dining room to celebrate, Sourdough Pete having somehow procured a bottle of good whiskey, and insisting on toasts to every single person present including the horses. And it was there, with the crew laughing and Tommy Larkin blushing furiously over some teasing about a Dodge City girl who had smiled at him near the stockyards, that Oscar rose from his seat, cleared his throat, and asked for quiet in a voice that carried an unfamiliar nervousness. "I've something I want to say," he began, and Fannie, watching him from across the table, felt her heart pick up its pace without quite knowing why. "These men here rode 400 miles with a boss most of them didn't want to ride for when we started. I include myself in that, though I'll admit I came around faster than most." A ripple of laughter went around the table. "But I want to say, in front of every one of you, that I have never in 11 years on the cattle trail seen courage and good sense combined the way I've seen it in Fannie Callahan these past months. She pulled a bull steer out of a river with her own 2 hands. She forgave a starving boy rather than see him hang. She stood up to a man twice her size and worth in front of a whole stockyard and made him run from his own lie. And somewhere along about the Cimarron River, in the middle of a lightning storm that near killed us both, I fell in love with her, and I have not managed to fall back out of it since, nor do I intend to try." He came around the table, and Fannie stood up to meet him, her heart hammering, the whole dining room gone silent and watching. "Fannie Callahan," Oscar said, reaching into his coat pocket and producing a small ring, plain silver, clearly bought hastily that very afternoon from some Dodge City jeweler. "I have no ranch of my own, and no fortune to offer you beyond a good horse and a reputation for keeping my word. But I have watched you build something out of grief and debt, and doubt that folks in 3 states are already calling a legend, and I would be honored beyond anything I have ever wanted in this life to spend the rest of my days building something alongside you, if you would have me. Will you marry me?" Fannie did not hesitate, though her eyes had gone bright with tears she made no effort to hide. "Yes," she said, and the dining room erupted into cheers loud enough to draw curious looks from the hotel lobby, and Sourdough Pete began weeping openly into his whiskey, declaring it the finest thing he had witnessed since the end of the war, and even the Fitch brothers, who had ridden off in cold suspicion from a dozen other outfits before, pounded the table and shouted their congratulations loud enough to be heard clear down the street. They were married 2 weeks later in Dodge City, in a small white church near the edge of town, with the entire drive crew standing witness, Sourdough Pete having insisted on baking a cake despite never having attempted such a thing before and producing something that was closer to a dense, sweetened biscuit than any proper wedding cake, though nobody minded a bit. And Tommy Larkin, at 19 the youngest of the crew, wept unashamedly through the whole ceremony and blamed it afterward on trail dust in his eyes. Henry Two Rivers gave Fannie away, since she had no living family to do it, and did so with a quiet, dignified pride that moved her more than she expected. And when the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, deaf Ruiz, who had not heard the question properly on account of his old injury, shouted, "No, sir, never," so loud and so early that the whole church broke into laughter, and even the preacher had to pause to compose himself before continuing. Fannie wore a dress of pale blue that she had bought that very week in a Dodge City dress shop, the first new dress she had owned since before her father's illness, and Oscar wore a borrowed suit that fit him poorly through the shoulders and did not seem to notice, and when he lifted her veil to kiss her as man and wife, the whole church rose up cheering in a way that made the preacher's wife, playing the small pump organ in the corner, momentarily lose the tune entirely and simply laugh along with everyone else. They rode south together after that, back toward Texas, the crew scattering to their own winter plans with pockets fuller than they had been in years. Tommy Larkin talking excitedly of a girl in San Antonio. He meant to court properly now that he had wages enough to offer her something. The Fitch brothers already discussing plans to sign onto the Callahan Keller ranch permanent, having decided over the course of the drive that they preferred working for people who had proven, beyond any argument, that they deserved the loyalty. Fannie and Oscar arrived back at the Callahan ranch in the first week of October, the cottonwoods along the creek gone gold and rust with the turn of the season, the same season that had begun, months before, with a father's funeral and a bank's threat, and a crew of doubting men who did not believe a woman could lead them anywhere worth going. They walked the ranch together that first evening home, hand in hand, past the barn that would soon be rebuilt with proceeds from the sale, past the corrals where new breeding stock would arrive come spring, past the small graveyard on the rise above the house where Michael Callahan rested beneath a headstone Fannie had commissioned before she left for Dodge City, engraved simply with his name, and the words he had told her 100 times growing up. "The cattle don't care what you were born, only what you do." "He'd be proud," Oscar said quietly, standing beside her at the grave in the fading autumn light. "He'd say I told you so," Fannie said, laughing through tears. "And then he'd ask why it took me so long to fall in love with a good man once I finally found one." Oscar pulled her close against his side, and they stood there together as the sun went down over the ranch that Fannie Callahan had saved with her own hands and her own nerve, and a trail boss's grudging respect that had grown, mile by mile, river by river, into something neither of them had expected to find on a cattle drive 400 miles from home. Word of the Callahan drive did not fade quickly. Newspapers as far off as San Antonio, and even a small item in a Kansas City paper, carried the story of the young Texas woman who had led her own herd to Dodge City against every prediction of failure, outfaced rustlers and slander alike, and married her trail boss at the journey's end. And for years afterward there were cattlemen across 3 states who told the story of Fannie Callahan's drive around their own campfires, some of them embellishing it further with each telling until it grew into something closer to legend than history, though the essential truth of it, that she had done what nobody believed a woman could do, and done it with mercy as much as grit, never needed any embellishment at all. The winter following the drive was a quiet one, the kind of quiet that comes after a long fight finally won, and Fannie and Oscar spent it rebuilding the ranch together in the way of two people who had already proven they could survive far worse than a hard winter. Oscar took to ranch life easily, having spent so many years working other men's cattle that the notion of finally working land and stock that was, in part, his own by marriage, filled him with a satisfaction he had not known he was missing. He and Fannie rode the property together most mornings, checking fences, planning where the new barn would stand, discussing which pastures would rest and which would carry the breeding herd through spring calving. The banknote was cleared in full that November, and the manager who had once eyed Fannie with such open doubt, when she came in alone to discuss the mortgage, now greeted her with the deference due any successful rancher, which amused her more than it satisfied any old grudge, though she did allow herself one quiet moment of pleasure signing the papers that released the mortgage entirely, papers she signed as Fannie Callahan Keller, a name that still felt new and bright in her mouth whenever she said it aloud. Tobias Wren, the old foreman who had ridden off rather than follow a woman's lead, came by the ranch that winter, hat in hand, considerably humbled by all he had heard of the drive's success, to ask, somewhat awkwardly, whether there might be work for him again come spring. Fannie considered him a long moment, remembering the sting of his doubt on the very evening of her father's burial, but she remembered too her father's own teaching about the uses of mercy, and she thought of the frightened rustler boy she had sent to the Hendersons rather than to a marshal, and she found she did not have the heart to turn away a man who had at least been honest about his doubts, rather than pretending loyalty he did not feel. "There's work," she told him, "same wages as before, but you'll answer to my husband on the trail same as any hand, and you'll answer to me on everything else, same as everyone does now. If that suits you, Tobias, we'd be glad to have your experience back on this ranch." He took the offer, chastened and grateful, and though it took him some months to fully unbend his old pride, by the following autumn he was among the loudest voices telling newcomers to the Callahan Keller ranch that Fannie Keller was as fine a cattle woman as any man he'd ever ridden for, proof enough that even old doubts could be worn down, given time and evidence enough to grind against them. Sourdough Pete retired from trail cooking after that drive, his joints too weary for another 400 miles, but he stayed on at the ranch as cook for the hands, and delighted for years afterward in telling any visitor who would sit still long enough the full and increasingly colorful story of Fannie Callahan's drive to Dodge City, a story that grew a little taller with every telling, but never once strayed from its essential and true heart. That a young woman nobody trusted had proven, mile after difficult mile, that trust was a thing a person earned through action rather than something owed to them by birth or by sex, and that the man who came to love her along that same difficult road had been wise enough to see her worth before the rest of the world caught up to the truth of it. Spring came, and with it the ranch's first calving season under Fannie and Oscar's joint management, and it proved a good one, the new breeding stock throwing strong, healthy calves in numbers that promised well for the herds to come. Oscar took naturally to the quieter rhythms of ranch ownership after so many years of trail work, though he confessed to Fannie one warm evening on the porch that he still felt the old pull toward the open trail sometimes, the particular freedom of waking each morning to nothing but sky and grass and cattle ahead of him. "Drive again next autumn," Fannie told him, resting her head against his shoulder as the sun set gold over the pastures. "This ranch will need to sell every year, same as it always did, and I don't intend to stop leading my own herds just because I've got a husband now to lean on." "I wouldn't want you to," Oscar said, and meant it entirely, "though I expect I'll ride beside you every mile of it same as this year, whether you need the help or not." "I'll always need you beside me," she said. "Not because I can't lead a drive without you, Oscar Keller, but because I don't want to lead anything at all, not this ranch, not a herd, not a single day of my life, without you next to me for it." He kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that carried in it all the miles they had already crossed together and all the miles still ahead, and somewhere out in the darkening pasture, a calf bawled for its mother, and the whole ranch settled into the particular piece of a place that had, against every doubt raised against it, found exactly the kind of future it deserved. Their first child was born the following June, a son they named Michael after Fannie's father, a sturdy, loud-voiced boy who came into the world with a full head of dark hair and a temper that made Sourdough Pete declare, laughing, that the boy had clearly inherited his mother's stubbornness along with his father's steady hands. Oscar held his son for the first time on the same porch where he had proposed to Fannie's memory 100 times in his mind before ever finding the courage to do it in truth, and wept, unashamed, in a way he had not done since his own father's death so many years before in Missouri. A daughter followed 2 years later, whom they named Grace after Oscar's mother back in Missouri, a gentle, watchful child who took, from her earliest years, to horses the way her mother had, riding before she could properly walk, much to Oscar's mingled pride and terror. The Callahan-Keller ranch prospered through the years that followed, weathering droughts and hard winters same as any Texas spread, but never again facing the particular desperate crisis that had driven Fannie north in the first place, because she had learned, on that single difficult drive to Dodge City, everything she would ever need to know about managing a herd, a crew, and a debt through hard circumstance. And she never again let the ranch's fortune slide so close to ruin as they had stood the spring her father died. She led 3 more cattle drives to market over the following decade, always with Oscar riding beside her as trail boss, and though none of those later drives carried quite the same desperate stakes or dramatic danger as the first, each one added to the legend that had begun that autumn in Dodge City, until Fannie Callahan Keller's name had become, across the cattle country of Texas and Kansas both, a byword for the particular kind of courage that does not announce itself with boasting, but simply does the work in front of it, mile after difficult mile, until the work is done. She was 51 years old when a young reporter from a Fort Worth newspaper came to interview her for a series of articles on the vanishing era of the great cattle drives, most of which had ended by then, with the coming of the railroads deeper into Texas itself, making the long trail drives north an increasingly rare thing, even as the century turned toward its close. He asked her, among other questions, what had made the difference, that first year, between the drive succeeding and the ranch falling to ruin as so many had predicted. Fannie thought about the question a long while, sitting on the same porch where she had once watched her crew ride out with their doubts still fresh, looking out now over a ranch grown twice the size her father had ever managed, with grandchildren's laughter drifting up from the yard where Michael's own children played, and Oscar, silver-haired now but still straight-backed in the saddle, working a young horse in the near corral. "I suppose," she said finally, "it was that I never once let another person's doubt become my own. Every man on that drive had a right to wonder if I could do it. I never held that against them, not truly, because doubt born of caution is just good sense wearing a worried face, but I would not let their doubt decide the matter before I'd had my own chance to prove it wrong, and I found along the way that the men who rode with me long enough to see me try, most of them came around to trusting me fair and square, not because I demanded it, but because trust earned honest is worth 10 times any trust just handed over cheap." "And Mr. Keller?" the reporter asked, glancing toward the corral. "Folks say he doubted you same as the rest at the start." "He did," Fannie agreed, smiling in a way that had lost none of its warmth across nearly 30 years of marriage. "But he was honest about his doubt, and willing to be shown wrong, which is a rarer virtue in a man than you might think. And when the trail nearly took my life in that river crossing, and again in that stampede, he came after me both times without a moment's hesitation, doubt or no doubt. That's when I knew the man's heart was worth trusting, whatever his early opinion of a woman's competence might have been. A person's doubts don't tell you near as much about their character as what they do once those doubts are tested." The reporter's article ran some months later under a headline that called her the woman who tamed the Western Trail, though Fannie herself, reading it on the porch with Oscar beside her, laughed at the phrase and said she had never tamed anything in her life, only survived it with as much grace as she could manage and asked for help when she needed it, which she considered a far more honest description of courage than any newspaper headline was likely to print. "They'll remember the legend," Oscar said, folding the paper closed, "long after they've forgotten the particulars. That's how these stories go, Fannie. 50 years from now, some rancher's daughter in Texas is going to hear a second-hand version of your drive to Dodge City and decide she can do anything at all, because a woman did it once and made it into legend." "Then I hope," Fannie said, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder as the Texas evening settled gold and quiet over the ranch they had built together, "that whoever she is, she finds herself a man as stubborn and as honest and as willing to be proven wrong as you were, Oscar Keller, because that made all the difference for me, same as the cattle and the courage did." They sat together on that porch as the sun went down, two people who had crossed rivers and outrun storms and faced down every doubt the world had thrown at them, and found, at the end of it, not merely survival but a love that had grown patient and deep as the land itself. And when Oscar finally rose to call the family in for supper, Fannie watched him go with the same warmth she had felt that long-ago night above the draw when he had pulled her from a stampede and told her, storm-soaked and trembling, that he loved her. Autumn came again that year, as it always did, gilding the cottonwoods along the creek and cooling the long Texas evenings, and the ranch that Fannie Callahan had saved with her own hands stood exactly as strong as it had the autumn she made it into legend, proof enough, if anyone still needed it, that some things, once truly earned, do not fade with the turning of the seasons but only grow more deeply rooted with each year that passes, same as love, same as trust, same as the particular kind of courage that asks for no one's permission before it begins the work in front of it. And that, in the end, was the whole of the story that folks along the Western Trail told for years afterward around their own campfires, embroidered here and there with details that grew taller with each telling, but never once losing the plain truth at its center. That a young woman nobody trusted to lead a cattle drive had led it anyway, 400 miles through river and storm and slander, and had found, at the far end of that impossible journey, both the fortune that saved her father's ranch and the love that would carry her through every autumn still to come.